This is episode 45 of the Life in Norway show. While the Northern Isles, Orkney and Shetland, are part of Scotland, the islands are also steeped in Norse history. I also have a family connection there, so I was keen to find out more about the island's Norwegian history from today's guest. Donna Heddle heads up the Institute for Northern Studies at the wonderfully named University of the Highlands and Islands in Scotland. We talk about the fascinating history of Orkney and Shetland and how that legacy shapes the culture, place names and language of the islands today. You can find out more about today's episode on the show notes page at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Just look for episode 45. Happy listening. I'm joined today by Donna Heddle. She is the director of the Institute for Northern Studies at the University of the Highlands and Islands in Bonnie, Scotland. Donna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, David. It's lovely to be here.
Now, we're talking today about Orkney and Shetland, and my more casual listeners who have a passing interest in Norway are unlikely to have heard of Orkney and Shetland and possibly not really understand the reason we're having a show on the islands today. We'll come on to the links with Norway later, but can we begin by just you giving us an introduction to Orkney and Shetland? Where are they, and so on?
Well, Orkney and Shetland, or the Northern Isles as they're also known, lie off the north coast of Scotland. They stretch from the southernmost point of the Orkney Islands, which is 6 miles north of the mainland of Scotland, to the outermost tip of the Shetland Islands, which is 120 miles off the coast of Scotland. They lie on latitudes 59 to 60, which makes them very, very close to Greenland, places like that. There are lots and lots of islands. The most northerly point in the British Isles is on Muckleflugga, which is the most northerly island in the Shetland Isles. We can't say exactly how many islands there are, David. That's often a subject of discussion in the pub on a Saturday night, because some are in uninhabited part of the year, some are skerries, some are larger ones. But generally in both island archipelagos, there's a large island which is more than half of the landmass, called mainland. Because the mainland means the main island in these island archipelagos. Scotland is another country and they do things differently there.
Do people say on the mainland in Orkney, and they mean the main island of Orkney, or they mean the Scotland, the main landmass?
They mean the main island of Orkney.
That must confuse tourists, maybe.
Well, it does a little bit, but that's just how it is. We're very self-sufficient. We have our own local councils, for example, local authorities, which makes a difference. So there's very much an island focus on life.
Excellent. So there is a lot of shared history and culture with Norway, but the islands have been inhabited for an extremely long time, as I understand it. There's Neolithic history of the islands. So before we talk about the links with Norway, could you sort of go back in time, thousands of years, and explain the history of the islands in that time period?
Well, your readers might like to know that the oldest standing house in the Western Hemisphere is on an island in Orkney called Pampawestri. It's called the Nap of Howard, and it was built probably about 3,800 BC. It's one of my favourite places, actually. It's 2 oval rooms, and, there it sits on this island. And empires rose and fell, and the tides ebbed and flowed, and that little place was continuously inhabited. So we first see habitation there about 3,800 BC. We have a lot of Neolithic archaeology. Standing stone circles, for example, and lots of Neolithic archaeology in both Orkney and Shetland, in fact. And most of this is pre-pyramids. It's pre the pyramids in Egypt. The only thing that comes after the pyramids in Egypt, really, that is a major thing, is the Ring of Brodgar, which is a standing stone circle, which is, in fact, larger than Stonehenge.
This is fascinating. So the oldest standing structure in the Western Hemisphere. And these islands, they're very windy and very wet. So this structure must have been incredibly well built for the time.
Well, this is what makes our archaeology so interesting, because traditionally at that time people would have built things out of wood. For example, we discovered the village of Skara Brae in the 19th century after a great big sandstorm, blew off all the sand from this village. Unfortunately, with climatic conditions now, the sand's coming back in. But it's stone built. It was the only one of that period that has been found that's stone built. And they were very good at building them, and they were very good at using the resources around them to create buildings like this. But yes, they are quite steady. We weren't always treeless. But yes, certainly we are very far north. For any listeners in Canada, for example, the place Churchill, Manitoba, where the polar bears come in and rake in the bins, is 5 degrees further south than Orkney is.
Interesting. I mean, the islands are very easy to see on a map, of course. You just look at Britain, look at the top right corner towards Norway, and you'll see them there in the ocean. And perhaps that's the reason that the Vikings found the islands. So can you tell us a bit about what do we actually know about the islands during the Viking era? Because I do see a lot of references to it, but what do we actually know rather than what's assumed?
Well, it's quite interesting because our perception of what constitutes the Viking Age has changed quite a bit in recent times. There was a kind of traditional narrative about this, that the Vikings who raided England and so on came from Norway. Chances are they actually came from Orkney and Shetland. So it's quite interesting to discover that we're maybe the bad boys in that particular story. Right. So there's some evidence for that. But the first appearance, if you like, of the Vikings is around about the 740s. We have the first appearance of the Vikings, of course, the raid in Lindisfarne in England, the raids on Iona as well. But in Orkney and Shetland, they were here for quite a long time before that, trading. And of course, island groups, because you can sail from Bergen to Shetland in just 3 days, as we know Håkon Håkonsson did in his saga there, it's quite understandable that people would know where that was. I mean, the Vikings were terrific navigators. And I'm using the Vikings, with some caution with that term. We wouldn't necessarily have called themselves Vikings, but it's more of an activity, if you like, or a part of the role of the Norse people. We
can call them the Northmen or the Norse.
Yes, well, there were lots of names for them. Askamani, Northmen in Gaelic, they're Lochlanach, the men of Norway, and so on. But we know that the Orkney Jarldom was founded quite early on in the 9th century. It was founded after the legendary voyage of Harald Fairhair. He established the kingdom round about, let's say, 850 there. And we start to see great earls such as Sigurd becoming earl in 874 and so on. So Orkney, the Jarldom of Orkney and the Lordship of Shetland was founded before, for example, the Viking kingdoms in Dublin. Just before that. So although to the modern viewer on a map there, and I have written a paper on Orkney and early maps if anybody's interested, but it looks remote and northern now, but it absolutely wasn't. It was very much on the route to somewhere all the time. All through its history, Orkney has been on the route to somewhere. For example, it was the last place you got fresh water before you went to the Arctic, when people started exploring the Arctic. It's also where the climatic scene in Frankenstein takes place, but that's a whole other story. But the fact of the matter is it was on a recognised trade route. It was very much the nexus of the Norse world, very much the centre of things. The Jarldom of Orkney was massive in the days of Thorfinn the Mighty, or the Raven Feeder, depending on what side you are. It was colossal. It was Caithness, Ross, Sutherland, Orkney, Shetland, part of the Hebrides, down to the Isle of Man and into the north of Wales, right? And also, these kind of maritime powers were the reason they did so well in the Viking Age is because there weren't a lot of roads in Scotland at that time, in the north of Scotland. We don't get roads to speak of north of Inverness in Scotland until the 18th century. Right, so everybody's travelling by boat, so that it's not surprising that a group of people with great maritime skills, a ruthless foreign policy, a very practical attitude to trading and making the best use of resources should do so well in these situations. And then, of course, you come to the Battle of Largs, of course. which is when we see the breakdown of Viking power in Scotland. That was Håkon Håkonsson then, who came over and took on our King Alexander III, King of Scots, at Largs, which is right down on the west coast of Scotland, very near England, in fact. But Håkon came by Orkney to pick up the Orkney boys, as was traditional, because the Orkney and Shetland men, they were farmers, but they were also mercenary sailors and soldiers as well, And Sweyn Asleifsson, for example, in the sagas, he plants his crops. Then he goes on what he calls his spring holiday, where he rapes and pillages down the coast of Ireland. Then he comes back and he gets in the harvest and has all that sorted. And then he goes for his autumn holidays, where he rapes and pillages somewhere else. So they're very much multitasking a lot of the time. But in 1263, we've got the Battle of Largs, which is an extraordinary event in Scottish history. Håkon Håkonsson, King of Norway, of course, brought together a huge fleet to attack the Scots at Largs. And one of my favourite stories about Scottish history, and there are many, is the story Alexander had what you might call a medieval spin doctor called Thomas of Ercildoune. Thomas made a lot of prophecies, and some of which are still coming true today. And so I imagine the scene to be something like this. Alexander goes to Thomas and says, Thomas, can you give me some kind of prophecy to cheer up the lads here? This is not looking good. This is really, really not looking good. So the prophecy that Thomas came out with was the Norsemen sailed from the Orcades to grasp at Alba's land, Alba being the name for Scotland, of course. But a greater lord than Håkon held Alba in his hand. The sun went dark at noonday, there was both wraith and scathe, the Norse were wrecked on Scotland, and the price was Håkon's death. I can imagine Alexander going, is that not a bit specific? But anyway, what happened was that there was, in fact, an eclipse of the sun, which caused a storm at sea. So before the battle started, an awful lot of the ships were dispersed. Håkon, who was on the pension, he was a good age, sustained a wound and came back and died here in Orkney. He was buried in the cathedral here for a few months till they took him back to Norway. But the upshot of it was that was the defeat of Viking power. So then you get the Treaty of Perth in 1266, when the only parts of Scotland that are still in Viking hands are Orkney and Shetland.
I have so many questions, Donna. Okay. That is a fascinating summary at the highest level. I mean, we could talk for hours on some of that, I think. But you mentioned there then that Orkney and Shetland remains in Viking hands. When did the islands transition to become part of the UK, and what's the story around that change?
Well, they didn't become part of the UK, of course. They became part of Scotland, and then Scotland became joined with England in the Treaty of Union. So they are not part of the UK, they're part of Scotland.
Right, yeah, of course.
Okay. Well, what happened was that the Norse earls died out. As usual, it was somebody called John. It's not a very lucky name, the last earl. And then the earldom became a Scottish earldom. And then what happened was, although still reporting back to the king of, it was Denmark, Norway by that time, of course. It was Denmark that owned them. It's always fascinating to me how the smallest country in Scandinavia rules them all. But of course, location.
Indeed.
So what happened was that a dynastic marriage was arranged between James III of Scots and Margaret of Denmark. And her father, Christian, was very short of the old cash. So the dowry, he pawned basically Orkney for 50,000 Rhenish florins with a view to paying that back. And a year passed and he still couldn't get the money together, so he pawned Shetland for much less money. But we don't talk about that, David, because Orkney was much better agricultural land, you see. We're wealthy, so we don't talk about the fact that we were worth a lot more. The upshot, though, this is in 1468, of course, the upshot was that, of course, Christian never got the money together. So in 1472, one bright February afternoon in 1472, Orkney and Shetland formally became part of Scotland. And they have never been given back to Norway. We have asked a couple of times. The King of Norway was over here recently. He was asked, and he had a good laugh and said, I don't think so. So possibly not, but there's a very, very strong Norse heritage in Orkney and Shetland to this day.
Well, you never know with the political situation the way it is in Britain and in Scotland these days. The possibility of maybe independence for Scotland and the islands specifically maybe has never seemed greater. Who knows,
yes,
though?
Indeed. Yes. But having said that, Orkney and Shetland are very strongly unionist. So it would be interesting to see what happens. Although things have changed a great deal since 2014, that is absolutely true, and thinking has shifted greatly.
Now, one of the big legacies of the stories you've been telling are names, and that's place names and the names of people. And as I've already told you before we started recording, my great-grandmother was from Orkney and had the surname Bork. Is that the right pronunciation?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell me a bit about that name and the importance, or not the importance, but the proliferation of Norse names in Orkney and Shetland today?
Well, it's an interesting fact that the oldest surnames in Orkney are all place names, like Bork. And the oldest surnames in Shetland are patronymics, such as Lawrenson, Thomason, Johnson, things like that. What happened was that the Orkney was the main seat of the Jarldom. The Jarl had a kind of a council, if you like, called Reithman, who advised him, who were local landowners and so on. Of course, they had the name of the place as their name, as most people did in those days. So they are the oldest names. And we have some very, very specific ones to Orkney. Heddle, for example, meaning Hay Valley. We've got Linklater, and as I was saying to you earlier on, the director Richard Linklater, which I'm sure some of your audience will have heard of, is of Orcadian descent, and his name means the heather by the stone, Linklater. So we have lots of names like that. The place names in Orkney are 99.6% Norse. So it's been a complete overwrite, if you like, of any previous narrative there. There are very, very few names in Orkney or Shetland. A couple of island names that we don't know the meaning of, like Unst. We don't know that. This is something that happens elsewhere. We don't really know the meaning of Lewis either, or Skye. These are Norse, and they're probably pre-Pictish as well.
Okay.
Quite interesting. But certainly the sense of attachment are very, very strong in the naming and so on. First names, Magnus has always been incredibly popular because of Earl Magnus, Saint Magnus. It was very important for his nephew, also a saint, St. Ronald, who was a very wily operator, actually, and realised that in Scandinavia the big thing was king-saint cults. So you had a king who was also a saint. So you combine the secular with the religious. And he did this for his uncle Magnus, who was an all-round good guy. And he built the cathedral for him. And the names Magnus and Ronald are very, very popular here. We also have a first name, which I don't think occurs anywhere else, and it's Thorfinn, which is an interesting mixture of the Norse and the Celtic there. And names for girls have become very popular, but in an interesting twist, the name Ola, which is a man's name in Norway, is a girl's name here.
Interesting stuff. And of course, the cathedral in Kirkwall is the St. Magnus Cathedral, that's right?
That's absolutely right. And it's described by our great poet, George Mackay Brown, as a great stone ship sailing on the sea. Because when it was built, of course, the waters would be lapping quite literally at the steps there. We have quite a lot of reclaimed land in Kirkwall now, including where the Institute for Northern Studies proudly stands on the edge of the bay looking out to sea in a true Norse tradition. But it's a magnificent cathedral built by the same masons who built Durham Cathedral. And it has a witch's dungeon and so on and so forth. And very excitingly, in the 19th century, when they were doing renovations in it, they found the bones of St. Magnus in the pillar with the dreadful injury to his head, which caused his death, clearly on that skull. Because he and his brother, his cousin. So Magnus and his cousin Håkon, which is not a popular name in Orkney at all for this very reason, shared the Earldom, as happened often in those days, and there was tremendous internecine warfare. So Magnus agreed to meet Håkon on the Isle of Egglesey to sort it out just mano a mano, basically, and got there to discover that Håkon had brought everybody with him and several ships. So Magnus realised the game was up here, and he was of a very, very religious bent anyway. And he said he would agree to be maimed so that he couldn't be Jarl anymore, because you have to be perfect. But no, Håkon insisted that he would have to be put to death, but nobody wanted to do it. So the cook Lifolf came along with his cleaver and struck Magnus right in the centre of his skull. And that was the injury found in the bones, which were then reverently replaced in the pillar and a cross put to mark where they were.
From what you've said, King Harald of Norway is fairly popular in the islands at the moment, but perhaps then his son Håkon may not be so popular when he takes over.
But it's all right. He's Håkon Magnus.
Of course.
We have a Norwegian consul here as well. We used to have a Swedish one and a Danish too. We have a Norwegian consul. So we celebrate Norway Day on the 17th of May. We have a tog and people out in their lovely bunads. That's one thing that makes me think I really ought to go back to Telemark, which is where the Heddles came from in the first place, because their bunad is so attractive. In Scotland, the men have the attractive national dress. The women have tartan sashes, which is not at all the same thing.
I was actually going to ask about Heddle, because I just published an article recently about Heddle Stave Church. So I guess that's the area of Telemark where you were originally from?
That's right.
Okay. We've been talking about names, but of course there's also the language that's used in the Northern Isles that has a strong Norse element to it. Now, obviously we're talking in English, and you have the lovely accent that's used in Orkney Shetland. But could you tell us a bit about now, am I right in saying it's a dialect that's used on the islands, or would you almost call it a language on its own?
Oh, that's fraught with dissension, isn't that, David? Well, what it was, you see, for 1,000 years, the language of Scandinavian Scotland was Norn, or Norrena, right? It's just all that Norse history in the rest of Scotland's just been lost and buried. So Orkney and Shetland Norn, the last speakers of Orkney and Shetland Norn as a full language, probably died out in the 18th century. Because when we were, it's called the Impignoration, actually, when we were handed over to Scotland in 1472, Norn was very much an everyday language. It wasn't a language that documents were written in the same way. They would be written in Norwegian or Latin, and later on, of course, Scots. So it's kind of worn away. But what we have is a vast vocabulary of Norse-influenced words. But more interesting to me is the way that sentences are constructed, which are very, very Norse. For example, we have a tendency to put the preposition at the end of the sentence. My husband will say, "I'm going out to look up by," that kind of thing. We use the verb to be rather than the verb to have to make the past tense. "I'm had me tea." "I'm had it." That kind of thing. So there's a lot of, I've written papers on this actually, because I find it quite fascinating. So what we have at the moment is what is called insular Scots, which is not a term I agree with, because I don't think the term insular is particularly helpful. I understand it means island, but it also means rather parochial. Sure. So I don't approve of that at all. But what we call it here, Orcadian or Orkney dialect. In Shetland, they call it Shetland or Shetland dialect. And there's very strong moves towards, preparing things. For example, I'm part of a large worldwide project to translate Alice in Wonderland into various languages, and I'm just finishing off the version in Orkney dialect. So people use it very consciously. There's Facebook pages, there's dictionaries been written, people sing in it, people text in it. And in Shetland, they don't say thou or you, they say do. So in a text, you might get see, do later, rather than say that kind of thing. So there's very active sense that this is very much part of the cultural heritage, but unfortunately it's not a language in its own right, although we do teach a module in it, in both of these things, and looking at the history and the development of it and so on. Scots is considered a minority language, but it has many variations of it as well. So there's lots of discussion around these topics, but people are very, very proud of their dialect, and perhaps the most commonly used word is pidi, which means small. I'm not very tall, so I would be described as a pidi lass, just a little girl, well, little woman. Let's not stretch it there. But yes, so it's very much part of the everyday cultural heritage. We have our own radio station, which is part of the BBC. It's called Radio Orkney. It's on in the morning, and the presenters there quite freely use dialect on that. Mm-hmm. And
is this something that essentially everyone on the islands would use, or is it just a proportion of those people that actively use the dialect?
It's a proportion, because we have quite a lot of people who've decided to move here.
Right.
We have a high proportion of people who have come from elsewhere, because Orkney is the safest place in the United Kingdom to live. Uh-huh. And it's regularly voted the top place, along with Shetland, to live. What we have is that there's a thing called code switching, which women do tend to do more than men, of course, and that's adapting your language to the situation in which you find yourself.
Mm.
So if two Orcadians are speaking together, there'll be very strong dialect usage. If an Orcadian is speaking to a non-Orcadian speaker, there won't be dialect usage, and there'll be various variations in between. And we have a thing that we call chanting, which is when you're on the radio or something and you're speaking very poshly and people don't recognise you. That's you chanting. That's you putting on airs. In Shetland, they call it knappen. And so I've heard people on the radio that I haven't recognised until the item is finished and they said, and that was Mary Smith or whatever it is, and you realise that's who it was. So there's a awareness of the social situations in which it is acceptable and not acceptable. Okay. And of course, like other dialects of Scots in the 50s and 60s, you were beaten for using it at school and so on. It's only in recent years, along with Gaelic, of course, and things like that. It's only in recent years that this linguistic diversity has been welcomed and supported, and it's very much supported by the Scottish Government, of course.
Yeah, I mean that's the case in Norway as well with the Sami languages, for example. It's a common thread in many countries. Now, with this fascinating history and the clear cultural legacy in names and languages, what does the relationship look like today between the islands and Norway? Are there economic links, or is it more a cultural exchange that takes place?
Well, it's interesting. There always have been economic links of various kinds. It might be to do with fishing, which of course is quite a strong industry, particularly in Shetland. Not always on the friendliest of terms, obviously, but the Shetland, for example, just to make a comment about the difference between Orkney and Shetland. In Orkney, an Orkney man is a farmer with a boat. In Shetland, he's a crofter. He's a fisherman with a croft, I should say. Yes. I see. So in Shetland, he's a fisherman with a croft. Yes. So there's quite different types of links there. We have a thing for school children to go across to Norway. Placements there, and we have a reciprocal thing for students to come here to Orkney and Shetland. So there are lots of different links. As I said, we celebrate Constitution Day. We have a North Atlantic sailing race between Orkney and Norway, for example. Various different kinds of links. And of course, it's we welcome many Norwegian visitors every year. Well, perhaps not this year, of course, but generally speaking, there's a high proportion of Norwegian visitors come to Orkney. And we have, for example, Norway provides us, which is very kind of them, with our Christmas trees every year because, of course, we don't have any. So the minister of the cathedral goes to Grimstad and also to Mora to cut two trees. We have one outside the door and one inside the door, both the gift of Norway. Thank you very much.
That's interesting because the Norway gifts a tree, of course, to Trafalgar Square in London, and that's generally sort of reported all around the world for some reason. But I didn't know the same thing happened with Orkney. That's nice to hear.
Well, of course, during the Second World War, this was Fortress Orkney. This was the key North Atlantic. There's about 20,000 people lived in Orkney at that time, but with the armed go up to about 65, 70,000 people here. And many of them were brave Norwegian pilots who would fly missions from here to Norway and sometimes, I'm afraid, just not make it back.
You mentioned the war. One thing I did want to ask about is a term I've heard used in Norway many times, but maybe you could explain what it actually is, and that's the Shetland Bus.
Oh, I knew you were going to say that to me, David. This is quite a marvellous example of comradeship and bravery. What it was that the members of the Norwegian resistance, which of course was the most decorated resistance in World War II, the Norwegian resistance were brought by fishing boats and whatever to Shetland, to Scalloway, and then brought through Shetland and Orkney and taken for training to Torridon and places like that in the Highlands of Scotland to be trained as radio operators and be given all that training, and then taken back. And hence it's the Shetland Bus, because it went back and forth. Now, I have a friend whose great aunt met her husband on that trip, and she now lives in the north of Norway. But it's commemorated by a lovely memorial, both in Scalloway and in the point of departure in Norway of the ship on the sea together. But many lost their lives on that trip, bravely doing that.
Something else I have to ask about is the festival on Shetland, the Fire Festival. Now, I'm probably not going to pronounce it right, given my experience so far on the call. Uphelia?
Yes, Uphelia, that's fine. Uphelia actually refers to a month or more of festivals all over Shetland in different parishes and places. The one that's probably best known is the Uphelia Festival in Lerwick, which is the capital of Shetland. That takes place on the last Tuesday in January, and we usually have a little clip of that on the national news at the end of the news, that kind of thing. And it's quite interesting where they came from, because traditionally, in many societies, there are sympathetic fire magic rituals that happen in the middle of the winter to reinvoke the sun, the Solus Invictus, bring back the sun. And that's where Uphelia has its roots, in this tar barrel flinging and setting fire to things and things like that. Now, in the 19th century, an interesting thing happened in society. Well, it really started at the end of the 18th century. Up until to that point, the life of an Orkney or a Shetland person was much the same in the 12th century as it was in the 18th century. Then we see two things: the Industrial Revolution, where people start to move for work, and the French Revolution, where the nature of society is cast into disarray. So what happens then later on is that people become dissatisfied and they want to know where they came from. So we have two origin myths that develop across Europe, essentially. The Celtic one, which is essentially what Scotland bought into, the red-haired lassie with the plaid and the whole thing and the warriors, all that. And the Norse one, which is what Orkney and Shetland bought into, and England, of course, as the Anglo-Saxons. And of course, that's the whole point of Lord of the Rings, is J.R.R. Tolkien creating an Anglo-Saxon myth with the Riders of Rohan, but that's a whole other podcast. So a group of antiquarians in Shetland got together and created the Uphelia Festival. So they made it a Viking festival. It was not a Viking festival before. It wasn't known as Uphelia. Right. So, and they wrote the Uphelia song, which is a cheery mix of waving your arms about and saying we're all Viking heroes and so forth, which is grand. And it's incredibly important in Shetland. It's something that people are involved in for many, many years. The Geyser Jarl, the leader of the main squad, the Jarl squad, there's about nearly 50 squads of people, but the Jarl squad is the one that is dressed as Vikings. And has the helmet with the great big black wings on it and everything like that. Somebody who's going to be a Geyser Jarl knows about this many, many years in advance. You become part of the committee, there's maybe a family history, you come up to being Geyser Jarl, you take out an insurance to pay for all of this because you have your own outfit, your squad has their own outfit, which they pay for and make themselves and everything. You choose a song, which is your march. You have your own, you spend all winter building the boat and drinking heavily, but while you're doing it, building the boat and then to burn it at Uphelia, which is what happens.
This sounds like a wonderful experience.
Well, you should come. They switch off all the lights in Lerwick, and there's 1,000 people with burning torches marching about Lerwick, and then they throw it all into the boat and burn it at the end.
I think I'll include some photos and a link to the festival in the show notes so that people listening can get an idea. It really does look as it sounds, I think it's fair to say. Now, Donna, listeners aren't going to be able to see this, but you actually have a Scottish and a Norwegian flag behind you side by side, which wasn't for this podcast, as you didn't realize it was there when I pointed it out. So I'm curious as to the identity that you and other islanders feel. Do you identify more as Scottish, as British, as Orcadian, or as Norwegian, or is it a big mix of these?
Well, I asked my husband about this one day, and he said it's a bit like being an onion. There are many layers. Right? I don't identify as British, no. It depends who you're dealing with, right? If you asked me if I was Orcadian, or you asked my husband if he was Orcadian, he would say Orcadian. That would be the first thing that he would say. If he was in Europe, he would say Scottish, because everybody loves the Scots. Yeah, a very good welcome. You wouldn't necessarily say you were British, because that doesn't go down so well quite a lot of the time. So I would say Orcadian Scottish. Okay. That's what I would say, but I am definitely Scottish. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Have you spent any time in Norway?
I have indeed. I've been fortunate enough to go to the Lofoten Islands.
Oh, wonderful.
Twice. And to Bodø, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly there. Which is so it's been very much in the north of Norway, because that was part of Northern Peripheries Programme projects that we were working on. We created an academic community right across Scandinavia. I was the coordinator. And we taught a virtual learning programme right across from Iceland to Russia. as part of this project, and we wrote a book on it called Northern Heritage. So I was very delighted to get to Norway. I've also been on holiday, of course, to Bergen with my sister last year, which was great, and of course the great Scottish-Norwegian connections there. Yeah. Think, of course, of Grieg and Peter Das and people like that. And I've also I was on a cruise with the National Trust of Scotland, which went across to Norway, and I lectured on that, and we went down as far as Stavanger, which is also very interesting.
You've mentioned several research projects there, so let's talk about the Institute for Northern Studies, part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. I love that name; it rhymes, which is a wonderful name to say. Tell us a bit about the institute. Is it a teaching institute, research, or a little bit of both?
Well, actually, it's teaching, research, and community engagement. We have 3 campuses: one in Orkney, one in Shetland, and one in Perth. Very appropriate if you think back to the Treaty of Perth. But it's there. We have in this country what's called the Research Excellence Framework exercise, where all universities are measured, all departments are measured against all the other ones. And we were rated 5th across the whole of the UK, equal with the University of Oxford. So that was rather nice. So we're an interdisciplinary institute. So we don't study things in isolation. We don't live in isolation, David. We study the whole picture. So we don't just look at language or literature or archaeology or whatever it is. We look at the whole picture. We're very much area studies. We're about places and everything that makes them what they are and everything that tells us about what they are and how we can explain them to other people. So we do teaching. We have master's programs. We have an undergraduate provision in culture and heritage, which is award-winning. We also train up, as part of our community duty, we train up the tourist guides. So that you get very echt information when you come to Orkney and Shetland, and indeed the Highlands and Islands. We also work with Vanuatu and Fiji, which is a little bit far away for an Institute for Northern Studies, but it's working on helping communities to sustain themselves using cultural heritage to create products.
Do I remember rightly? I think I remember when researching this show that you've done some consultancy work with the distillery in Orkney. Is that right?
We have indeed. Highland Park, who very kindly sponsor all our conferences, so we're awash with whiskey at those events. What happened actually was quite interesting, and it just shows the power of academic research in many ways. Because in 2012, there was an announcement on Radio Orkney, which I was mentioning to you earlier as our local station, that the Edrington Group, who own Highland Park, were going to create a series of whiskies based on Vikings. And they were going to start off, they thought, with Eric Bloodaxe, whom they assumed was the Earl of Orkney. So, of course, I had to do something about that. So I got on the phone to discover, of course, that their marketing department was way down south in Perth.
Right.
So they came up to see me, and I suggested to them that because the blockbuster Thor was coming out in 2012, that they started off with what became the Valhalla collection, which was it was released in limited edition, starting with Thor, which was the biggest edition. I think it was 25,000 bottles. Then there was Loki, which was 23,000. Then it was Freya, which was I think 19, and then Odin, which was 17,000. And we did that, and we had the world launch of those whiskies here with an evening at which I portrayed an Irish slave playing the harp in the corner, and things like that. But the interesting thing there was 2 things. One, that was the first whiskey ever called after a woman, Freya. And we created it so that the bottle put light through it, because she's Queen of the Northern Lights too, so that the whiskey reflected greenish lights through it. And also, when we were sitting talking about the marketing of this, we've done a number of iterations of things, but this is the first one. They said, we're going to market this to Japan. I said, why are you marketing something called the Valhalla Collection to Japan? Why aren't you marketing it to Russia? And they said, why would we market to Russia? I said, Russia, it means place of the Vikings. In a lot of the city-states, they've got little galleys, like Nizhny Novgorod's got a Viking galley on it. So they did, and they sold a lot, and we're on News at 10, which was great. So we've worked steadily with them through mythic beasts and all sorts of things like that. But it's great to be able to put your academic research to some practical use that sustains the community that you are researching yourself.
Yeah, I mean, everything from working with a distillery to help them achieve commercial success by the sounds of it, to training local tour guides, and plus all the teaching and research. It sounds fascinating. So, Donna, I know we could talk for hours, but we're just about out of time. So perhaps you can tell us where we can find out more about some of the research you do at the Institute.
Well, you can find us at our webpage, which is www.ins.ac.uk, or you can just Google me, Donna Heddle, Donnaheddle, and you'll find us there. But Institute for Northern Studies will always find us.
And I will put links to everything we've spoken about today, and plenty of photos as well, I think, onto the show notes page, which you'll be able to find at lifeinnorway.net/podcast. Donna, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been truly fascinating.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you for asking me.